Fluorescent lights hummed a low, migraine-inducing pitch against sterile office walls. A vacuum cord tangled around a tired man's heavy work boots. One wrong turn down the executive hallway, one unlatched mahogany door, that was all it took for an invisible maintenance worker to crash headlong into a billionaire's most heavily guarded reality. He was not supposed to be on this floor. He was never supposed to see what waited on the other side of that door. And the woman standing inside that office was about to do something that no janitor making $15 an hour could have ever predicted. The industrial lemon cleaner didn't smell like real lemons. It smelled like chemicals and desperation, a sharp artificial tang that clawed at the back of Thomas Miller's throat as he dragged the heavy mop across the polished marble of the 42nd floor. The wet strands slapped against the baseboards with a rhythmic, hollow thwack that echoed down the empty corridor. It was 11:14 on a Tuesday night. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled in a grid of orange sodium lights and crawling headlights. Inside Apex Holdings, the air was stagnant, cold, dry, filtered through miles of aluminum ductwork that hummed faintly overhead like a dying appliance. Thomas stopped and leaned his full weight against the mop handle. His lower back screamed, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from his lumbar spine down to his right knee. He was 34, but his joints belonged to a man twice his age. The dark blue polyester uniform clung to his shoulder blades, stiff with dried sweat and the faint smell of stale coffee from a spill he'd scrubbed out of the breakroom carpet 3 hours ago. He dug a calloused thumb into his eye socket, trying to rub away the grit. He wasn't thinking about the multi-billion-dollar acquisitions that happened on these floors during the daylight hours. Thomas was doing mental math. Rent was due in 4 days. He was $80 short. The overtime tonight covered $40. If he picked up a weekend shift at the diner, that was another $50. It left just enough for milk, bread, and maybe the asthma inhaler refill for Sarah. The thought of his 7-year-old daughter sent a familiar heavy pang through his chest. She was asleep right now, curled up on the sagging floral sofa in Mrs. Gable's apartment 2 floors down from their own. He pictured the way she gripped the edge of her fleece blanket in the slight wheeze in her breath when the radiator made the apartment air too dry. He hated leaving her there. He hated the pity in Mrs. Gable's eyes every Friday when he handed over a wad of crumpled $5 bills, but a single dad with a high school diploma and a bad knee didn't have the luxury of pride. Thomas hoisted the heavy plastic bucket. The dirty water sloshed against the rim. He moved toward the service elevator, the wheels squeaking an irritating pitch that bounced off the empty walls. He keyed his badge against the scanner. A sharp beep. A green light. The doors parted. His route sheet said he was supposed to finish the 42nd floor and clock out, but the night manager, a perpetually sweaty man named Greg, who never went anywhere without a clipboard and a grievance, had caught him in the locker room. Top floor needs a sweep, Tommy. Someone left a mess in the boardroom. Don't touch the desk in the main office. Just empty the bins and get out. The 50th floor. The penthouse suite. The domain of Evelyn Croft. Even the night crew spoke of the CEO in hushed, cynical tones. She wasn't just a boss. She was an abstract concept of power, a woman who gutted failing tech startups, sold them for parts, and fired thousands without a flinch. Thomas had seen her once, months ago. She had walked past him in the lobby, surrounded by men in sharp suits. He remembered the click of her heels against the granite, the faint scent of something expensive, bergamot maybe, and cold cedar. She hadn't looked at him. To her, he was part of the architecture, a moving fixture in a blue shirt holding a trash bag. The elevator chimed softly. The doors opened to the 50th floor, and the atmosphere shifted. Down below, the carpet was thin industrial weave, meant to withstand thousands of scuffing shoes. Up here, it was a plush dark charcoal that swallowed the sound of his boots entirely. The fluorescent glare was replaced by warm recessed lighting that cast soft shadows against walls paneled in real mahogany, not veneer. Thomas left the mop bucket in the vestibule. He unclipped the heavy black trash bag from his belt and grabbed his microfiber cloth. His pulse ticked up. He hated being in the executive spaces. It felt like trespassing in a museum where you couldn't afford a single artifact. The boardroom was easy. 3 crumpled coffee cups, a stack of shredded documents, a whiteboard wiped clean. He tied off the trash bag, the plastic crinkling loudly in the dead silence. He checked his watch, 11:45. If he hurried, he could catch the 12:10 bus, save himself a mile of walking in the sleet, and be in bed by 1. He stepped out and looked down the hall at the final door. Evelyn Croft, Chief Executive Officer. The brass nameplate caught the dim light. The door was closed but not latched. A thin sliver of yellow light bled from the crack onto the charcoal carpet. Thomas hesitated. If he left a full trash can in the CEO's office, Greg would dock his pay. If he went in and disturbed something, he could be fired. 5 seconds, jaw clenched, weighing the risk. The building was empty. He reached out and pushed. He didn't find an empty room. He saw a pair of black stilettos kicked haphazardly onto the Persian rug, a tailored suit jacket thrown over a leather chair, and Evelyn Croft, standing in the middle of her office, half undressed, both hands twisted behind her back, fingers straining to unclasp something tight and mechanical wrapped around her torso. It was a rigid, heavy-duty medical corset. Thick straps of black canvas and metal bone clamped around her ribs and lower spine. As she moved, her skin shifted beneath it, revealing a landscape of mottled bruises, deep purples and sickly yellows, fading into pale flesh. Thomas froze. His brain short-circuited into primal panic. Evelyn turned her head. She didn't scream, she didn't gasp. Her hands simply fell away from the clasps. For 3 excruciating seconds, the silence was absolute. Her eyes were dark, bloodshot, calculating. She looked at his cheap uniform, his pale face beneath the blue cap, the trash bag trembling in his fist. "You aren't Marcus," she stated. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. Thomas choked. "I'm sorry. The door," the manager told me. He stumbled backward, heel catching the rug. "Get out." Flat, devoid of emotion. Thomas scrambled into the hallway. The door slammed shut. He leaned against the wall, breathing ragged, cold sweat across his forehead. A billionaire didn't wear a heavy-duty rib brace unless something was deeply wrong. And people with that much money didn't like people like Thomas, knowing their secrets. He waited for security boots on the carpet. 1 minute. 2. Nothing. He ran for the elevator, dragged his mop bucket to the service bay, and hit the street. The sleet had turned to freezing rain. On the midnight bus, he slumped into a plastic seat and stared out the rain-slicked window. Tomorrow his badge would be dead, he was certain. But 50 floors up, Evelyn Croft sat in her leather chair in the dark. The unfastened brace rested on her desk. She held a glass of neat scotch and stared at the closed door, memorizing the exact shade of terrified, desperate panic she had seen in the janitor's eyes. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 in the afternoon, not a digital chime. An old mechanical rattle that vibrated against the chipped veneer of the nightstand. Thomas lay in the semi-darkness, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a deformed continent. His knee throbbed in time with his heartbeat. From the living room came the faint, high-pitched wheeze of Sarah's breathing, and the scratch of a crayon against cheap printer paper. He dragged himself up. The panic from last night had calcified into lead in his stomach. Today his badge would flash red. Security would hand him a cardboard box and walk him to the curb. He made Sarah a bowl of generic cornflakes, packed her lunch with the heels of the bread loaf. "Daddy, you look gray," she said around a mouthful of cereal. "Just tired, bug." He kissed her forehead. Her skin was a little too warm. By 10 that night, Thomas stood in the sleet outside the glass monolith. He pressed his badge to the reader. Beep. Green. He pushed through, heart stuttering. In the basement, Greg grunted without looking up. "Leave the cart. You're wanted upstairs." 50th. A man in a razor-sharp gray suit waited in the vestibule. Mr. Hayes. Mannequin carved from ice. "Follow me." He led Thomas straight to the heavy mahogany door, opened it, gestured him inside, and pulled it shut. Evelyn sat behind the vast expanse of her glass desk, blazer black, posture impossibly rigid. She didn't look up. "You didn't run to the press." "No." "You didn't tell your manager." "No." "Why?" "Because I need this job. I scrub toilets for $15 an hour. If I talk about the CEO, I get fired. I have rent. I have a kid. I can't afford to care about your secrets." The most honest thing he had said in years. Evelyn tossed a manila folder onto the glass. "Thomas Miller, 34. Honorable discharge. infantry, medical, blew out your knee in a training exercise. Single father, debt to a local clinic for pediatric asthma treatments. Credit score in the low 500s. No criminal record. Desperate. Thomas felt his face flush hot with humiliation, his hands curled into fists on his thighs. She had reduced his entire existence to a single word. Desperate. Before he could respond, Evelyn continued. I was in a helicopter crash 4 months ago. The shift slammed the brakes on his anger. Pilot error. We went down hard in the Cascades. The press thinks I was on a spiritual retreat in Kyoto. The board thinks I had a minor ski accident. The reality is 3 fractured vertebrae and 4 shattered ribs. She leaned forward and winced. The board is in the middle of a hostile acquisition of a logistics firm. If the shareholders discover the CEO is held together by canvas and metal, unable to sit for more than 2 hours without narcotic painkillers, the stock tanks. They invoke a medical clause and vote me out by Friday. I need a handler, she said. A shadow. You drive the car. You carry the bags. You stand in corners with my medication. When my back gives out, you hold me upright so the cameras don't see me fall. $3,000 a week, cash, full corporate medical for you and your daughter, effective immediately. The numbers hit Thomas like a physical blow. That was more than he made in 3 months. A new apartment. The expensive inhalers, the specialist doctors. What's the catch? You belong to me, Evelyn said. No days off until the merger closes in 6 weeks. If you slip, if you talk, if you look at me with pity, I will ruin you. Thomas looked at the billionaire. He saw the cold arrogance, but beneath the edge of her collar, the faint imprint of canvas strap dug into her collarbone. She was terrified. She was bleeding out in a shark tank, paying the nearest stranger to act as a tourniquet. When do I start? He asked. The transition was violent. On Wednesday, Thomas was scrubbing urinals. On Friday, he was wearing a bespoke black suit that cost more than his car, standing beside a black armored SUV in the underground executive garage. The suit didn't fit right. He had the broad, blocky shoulders of a laborer, and the wool pulled tight across his back. The collar scratched his neck. He felt like a dog shoved into a sweater. The shoes were worse, stiff Italian leather that pinched his toes and offered zero support for his wrecked knee. He missed his work boots with a sincerity that bordered on grief. The first 2 weeks were a grueling lesson in the brutal logistics of immense wealth. Evelyn Croft didn't live a life. She executed a military campaign. Her day started at 5 in the morning and ended past midnight. She moved between high-rise boardrooms, private restaurants smelling of truffle and stale cigar smoke, and a penthouse apartment that felt more like a museum than a home. Thomas was the invisible machinery keeping her upright. He learned the subtle cues with the instinct of a man trained to read a combat zone. When her left hand gripped the edge of a table so hard her knuckles went white, the nerve pain in her spine was firing. When her voice dropped to a terrifyingly quiet whisper during negotiations, she was fighting off a wave of nausea from the painkillers. When she pressed her right elbow against her ribs during a handshake, the bone fragments were grinding together beneath the brace. Their dynamic was not friendly. It was transactional, abrasive, fraught with a silent mutual resentment that filled the armored SUV like exhaust fumes. Slower over the speed bumps, Miller, she snapped from the back seat one rainy Tuesday. I didn't hire you to test the suspension. The suspension is fine, Thomas replied, gripping the steering wheel. The city hasn't paved this road since the 90s. Do you want me to reroute and make you 10 minutes late for the acquisitions meeting? I want you to do your job without the commentary, she shot back, her voice tight with pain. He glanced in the rearview mirror. She had her eyes closed, one hand pressed hard against her lower ribs. Her face was gray in the passing streetlights. Thomas felt a flicker of something. Not pity, he knew better. A grim solidarity. Pain was pain. It didn't care about the zeros in your bank account. His bad knee was screaming right alongside her shattered spine, both of them pretending they were fine, both of them lying through clenched teeth. He wondered if she knew, if she could tell by the way he shifted his weight at red lights, or the way he braced himself when he climbed out of the driver's seat, that his body was failing him too, just at a fraction of the price. Every night, he called Mrs. Gable to check on Sarah. For the first time in 5 years, he had enough money for the good inhalers. the ones that actually worked instead of the generic garbage that left his daughter gasping by midnight. Sarah hadn't wheezed in 3 days. She was sleeping through the night, a full 8 hours without the rattling cough that used to jolt Thomas awake in a panic. She was coloring at the kitchen table instead of curled up on the sofa with a nebulizer mask pressed against her small face. Thomas didn't tell her about the new job. He said Daddy switched shifts. Some truths were too heavy for a 7-year-old. It happened during the 3rd week. They had just returned from a brutal 4-hour dinner with European investors. Evelyn walked into the foyer of her penthouse, her movements stiff, robotic. She made it to the edge of the velvet sofa, before her legs simply gave out. Thomas caught her. He grabbed her under the arms, his heavy boots bracing against the hardwood floor. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound of agony, her nails digging into the sleeves of his suit jacket. She smelled of expensive champagne and cold sweat. "Don't," she hissed through gritted teeth, trying to push him away. "I can stand." "No, you can't," Thomas said. His voice dropped into the flat, authoritative tone he used to use in the infantry when a wounded soldier was trying to walk on a broken leg. He didn't ask permission. He scooped her up, his bad knee screaming in protest, and carried her to the master bedroom. He set her down on the edge of the silk-sheeted bed. She was shaking violently, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. "The brace," she choked, pointing at her ribs. "It seized. The clasp is jammed." Thomas knelt in front of her. The physical proximity was jarring. For weeks, she had been a voice giving orders from the back seat. Now he was inches from her face. He could see the fine lines around her eyes, the exhaustion carved into her skin like something permanent. He reached under the hem of her blazer, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the silk of her blouse. He found the cold metal clasps of the thoracic brace, heavy-duty ratchets used in severe orthopedic trauma. The locking mechanism on the left side had bent inward, digging brutally into the bruised flesh of her ribs. "I have to force it," he said, looking up at her. "It's going to hurt." Evelyn stared at him, her eyes wide, terrified, and entirely human. She nodded once. Thomas gripped the metal lever. He braced his forearm against the rigid canvas. He pulled. The metal resisted, then gave way with a loud snap. Evelyn let out a choked sob, her forehead dropping forward to rest against Thomas's shoulder. He froze. He was a janitor. She was a billionaire. He was acutely aware of his cheap deodorant and the lingering smell of exhaust on his clothes. But he didn't pull away. He stayed perfectly still, letting her breathe, letting her hide her face against his cheap suit jacket. Slowly, carefully, he unlaced the rest of the corset and set the heavy canvas on the floor. She sat back, pulling her blouse tight. As Thomas stood, his knee cracking loudly, something slipped from his jacket pocket onto the hardwood. A crayon drawing, stick figures, a tall man in blue, and a little girl holding a green balloon. Evelyn picked it up, her thumb brushing over the jagged lines. "Sarah, my daughter. Is the insurance covering the treatments?" "Yeah. She got the good inhalers on Monday. She hasn't wheezed in 3 days." Evelyn looked at him, really looked. She saw the dark circles, the permanent tension in his shoulders. She saw a man selling his dignity to keep a child breathing. "Good," she said quietly. "Make sure Hayes schedules you off on Sunday. You should take her to the park." Thomas stared at her, surprised. "Good night, Miss Croft." "Evelyn," she said to his back as he walked toward the door. "When it's just us, Miller, it's Evelyn." The threat materialized 10 days before the merger deadline. Hayes intercepted Thomas in the underground garage at 6 in the morning. His mannequin composure cracked for the first time since Thomas had known him. His tie was loosened 1/4 of an inch. For Hayes, that was the equivalent of screaming. "Richard Caldwell," he said, handing Thomas a tablet with a dossier on the screen. "Board member, old money, 3rd generation Wall Street. He's been making calls." Thomas scrolled through the file while Hayes spoke in clipped, precise sentences. Caldwell had privately contacted 3 other board members in the past week, raising pointed questions about the CEO's physical and mental fitness. He wasn't asking out of concern, he was laying groundwork. For 18 months, Caldwell had been quietly acquiring Apex Holdings shares through a shell company called Greystone Capital Partners, positioning himself for a hostile internal takeover. If the medical clause in Evelyn's contract was triggered, a fitness review would be mandatory. If she failed, the board could vote her out, and Caldwell would be waiting in the wings with enough shares to claim the chair before the seat was cold. The source of his leverage was worse. One of the 3 private physicians Evelyn was paying to keep silent had been compromised. Caldwell had a preliminary medical report, not definitive, but enough to force the question in front of the full board, and forcing the question was all he needed. The mere suggestion of incapacity during a high-stakes merger would spook the institutional investors. The stock would dip, confidence would fracture, and Caldwell would be standing there with a sympathetic smile and a motion to establish an emergency leadership committee with himself as acting chair. Thomas watched Evelyn absorb the news that afternoon. She stood at the window, her back to the room, one hand pressed flat against the glass. She didn't curse. She didn't panic. She went quiet in a way that Thomas had learned to recognize as dangerous, the way a storm goes quiet before it tears the roof off a building. Then she turned and told Hayes to cut her painkiller dosage in half. Thomas opened his mouth. She silenced him with a look. "I need to be sharp," she said. "Sharp enough to gut him before he guts me." The consequence was immediate and brutal. Without the full dose, the pain roared back unchecked. Thomas saw it in the way she gripped door frames when she thought no one was looking, in the shallow, ragged breathing between meetings, in the tremor that appeared in her left hand during conference calls. She was burning her body down to fuel her mind, and the cost was written across her face in gray skin and clenched teeth and eyes that hadn't closed properly in days. Thomas recognized the math. He had done the same calculation 100 times in the infantry. Trade sleep for alertness, trade healing for function, trade tomorrow for today. The difference was that when Thomas had done it, he was 22 with a body that could absorb the punishment. Evelyn was running the same equation on a frame held together by canvas straps and pharmaceutical chemistry, and the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. That night, driving back from a tense board dinner, Thomas glanced in the rearview mirror. Evelyn sat perfectly still, eyes closed, both hands clenched into fists on her thighs. He said nothing. He eased off the accelerator and took the speed bumps slower than he ever had before. She opened her eyes. She caught his gaze in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't tell him to watch the road. She just closed her eyes again. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was permission to care without either of them having to say the word out loud. The Metropolitan Museum smelled of white lilies, expensive gin, and the suffocating arrogance of old money. It was the final social hurdle before the logistics merger closed. Thomas stood near a marble pillar, the collar of his rented tuxedo scraping his neck, his eyes locked on Evelyn across the crowded gallery. She wore a high-waisted emerald gown, structured meticulously to conceal the rigid canvas brace underneath. She held a flute of champagne she wasn't drinking. She had been standing for 3 hours, and Thomas had been counting every minute. He watched her left hand drift toward a high-top cocktail table. Her fingers gripped the linen cloth. Her knuckles went bone white. She was failing. Richard Caldwell approached with 2 associates flanking him like jackals. They smiled, but it was the smile of wolves testing a weak fence. If she showed weakness now, they would pause the merger, demand a medical review, and force her out before the ink was dry. Thomas didn't wait for a signal. He moved. He cut through the crowd of silk gowns and tailored suits, stepping smoothly to Evelyn's left side, placing his broad frame between her and Caldwell just as the man opened his mouth. "Miss Croft," Thomas said, his voice flat and loud enough to interrupt. "Tokyo Operations is holding on line 1. They need immediate authorization on the freight routing." Caldwell scowled. "We are in the middle of a discussion, young man." Thomas looked at him, unblinking. "I apologize, sir. Tokyo won't wait." He offered his arm. The moment her hand rested on his sleeve, Thomas felt the terrifying degree of her exhaustion. She was in freefall. He took 90% of her weight, steering her out of the grand hall and down a dim corridor with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who had been carrying wounded soldiers since he was 21 years old. He pushed open the heavy door of an empty coat room and locked it behind them. Evelyn collapsed against the wall. The champagne flute shattered on the tile. She slid to the floor, gasping, her nails digging into the silk over her ribs. Tears of pure, humiliating agony streaked mascara down both cheeks. "I can't," she choked. "The bone is shifting." Thomas dropped to his knees in the broken glass. He pulled the silver pill case from his pocket, uncapped a water bottle from a catering cart near the door, and pressed 2 white tablets into her shaking hand. She swallowed them dry. Thomas sat beside her on the cold tile. The room smelled of damp wool, heavy perfume, and spilled wine. "You saved me," she whispered to the dark ceiling. "I did my job," Thomas replied, staring at his boots. "No," Evelyn said, her voice stripped of every layer of corporate armor. "You saw me drowning, and you pulled me out." He looked at her, in the dim light, mascara ruined, the emerald gown twisted around her knees. She didn't look like a billionaire. She looked like someone who had been fighting alone for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her. "We're both just trying to survive, Evelyn," he said quietly. "Your monsters just wear nicer suits than mine." It was the first time he had called her by name without being invited. She didn't correct him. She just sat next to him on the cold floor, 2 broken people surrounded by shattered glass. And for the first time in a very long while, neither of them was pretending to be whole. The morning after the gala, Evelyn didn't wake to pain. She woke to fury. Cold, calculated, surgical fury. She called Hayes at 5 in the morning. "Pull every internal transaction Caldwell has executed in the past 18 months. Every stock purchase, every board communication, every dinner receipt, every email to every physician whose name appears on my payroll. I want the shell company traced to his name by noon." Hayes delivered before 11. Greystone Capital Partners, registered in Delaware under 3 layers of corporate structure, traced directly back to Caldwell's personal holdings. The share accumulation pattern was textbook. Slow acquisitions timed precisely around board meetings where Evelyn's health had been subtly questioned. It wasn't concern for a colleague. It was a financial coup disguised as corporate governance, and the disguise wasn't even good. It was arrogant, the kind of sloppiness that came from a man who believed he was too powerful to be caught by a woman he considered an inherited figurehead. Thomas's role shifted. He was no longer just a shadow holding pill cases and car doors. Evelyn began sending him across the city with sealed envelopes to her private attorney, a woman in a brownstone office on the Upper East Side who never smiled and never asked his name. He didn't understand the contents of the documents. He didn't need to. He understood urgency, and the urgency was a living thing vibrating through every interaction, every sealed envelope, every phone call Evelyn conducted in her bathroom, where the acoustics made eavesdropping impossible. He watched her work 20 hours straight, her body a ruin propped up by willpower and black coffee, her mind a blade being sharpened against the stone of Caldwell's betrayal. She was dismantling him the way she dismantled failing companies. Methodically, ruthlessly, without a gram of sentimentality. At 3 in the morning, Thomas found her in the penthouse living room, sitting on the hardwood floor because the chairs hurt too much, surrounded by legal documents and financial printouts, spread in a semicircle around her like the petals of some grim, papery flower. He didn't tell her to rest. He knew she wouldn't listen. He set down beside her a glass of water, a single painkiller, and a new crayon drawing from Sarah. This one was different. 3 stick figures instead of 2. The tall man in blue, the little girl with the green balloon, and a woman with black hair standing next to them. Sarah had never met Evelyn, but Thomas had mentioned her once in the car while Sarah chattered on speakerphone about dinosaurs, and the 7-year-old had remembered. Evelyn picked up the drawing. She held it for a long time, longer than she had looked at any document that night. Her thumb traced the jagged crayon lines where the black-haired woman's hand almost touched the little girl's green balloon string. Something shifted in her face, not softness exactly, but the absence of hardness, the way a fist slowly unclenches when the threat passes. She didn't say anything, but she placed it on her desk, right next to her tablet, where she would see it first thing every morning. Thomas stood in the doorway and watched. He didn't say goodnight. He just pulled the door closed and walked to the elevator, carrying the image of a billionaire on the floor in the dark, holding a crayon drawing like it was the only real thing in the room. The boardroom on the 50th floor was full for the first time in months. Every seat taken. The merger vote was the official agenda, but the tension had nothing to do with logistics contracts. Caldwell sat near the head of the table, flanked by 2 allies. He looked confident, almost relaxed, the posture of a man who believed the hand was already played and won. When the preliminary discussion concluded, Caldwell cleared his throat. and stood. "Before we proceed to a vote," he said, adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical precision, "I believe we need to address a matter of corporate responsibility. Specifically, the physical capacity of our CEO to lead this company through a merger of this magnitude." He produced a folder. "A preliminary medical assessment, fragments obtained through a compromised physician. I have reason to believe that Miss Croft has been concealing a significant medical condition from this board." He placed the folder on the table with a flourish of manufactured concern. Evelyn let him finish. She sat perfectly still, hands flat on the glass, face unreadable. She waited 3 seconds. "Are you finished?" Caldwell blinked. The confidence flickered, just for a fraction of a second, like a candle in a draft. Evelyn opened her tablet. She turned the screen toward the board. What followed took 11 minutes. 11 minutes that dismantled 18 months of careful, arrogant scheming. She walked them through every stock purchase, funneled through Greystone Capital Partners, traced to Caldwell's personal holdings with forensic precision. She showed them the insider trading pattern, the strategic timing around her health inquiries, the clear violation of SEC Rule 10b-5. Then the emails, correspondence between Caldwell and the compromised physician, direct solicitation of confidential medical records in violation of federal law. "You weren't concerned about my health," Evelyn said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "You were executing a hostile takeover from the inside. You used a confidential medical relationship to manufacture leverage against the woman who signs your board stipend." The room went silent, not the polite silence of consideration. The crushing silence of 12 people realizing they had been sitting next to a predator for 18 months. Caldwell's allies wouldn't meet his eyes. His face went the color of wet cement. "I forwarded the complete file to the SEC and to corporate counsel this morning," Evelyn said. "You can resign voluntarily, or you can be escorted out by building security. I would recommend the first option." Caldwell stood. He didn't speak. He straightened his jacket with hands that were not quite steady, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy door closed behind him with a sound like a coffin lid settling into place. Nobody followed him. The merger vote passed unanimously. Evelyn signed the documents, page after page, her hand trembling slightly, but the pen didn't hesitate. Thomas stood in the corner near the door, his hand resting on the silver pill case in his jacket pocket. Nobody in the room looked at him. He was invisible again, the same way he had been invisible pushing a mop on the 42nd floor. But when Evelyn set down the pen and raised her head, her eyes found him across the long table. 1 look. 2 seconds. Enough. His phone buzzed. A photo from Mrs. Gable. Sarah at the kitchen table, tongue out in concentration, drawing a new picture. A tall building with a tiny stick figure standing at the very top. Thomas smiled for the first time that day. 6 months later, the canvas brace was gone. The merger had made Apex Holdings untouchable. Thomas didn't go back to pushing a mop bucket. He had a fabricated title, Director of Executive Logistics, and a real desk on the 49th floor with a window that overlooked the same city he used to watch from the back of a midnight bus. He still hated the corporate world. The wool suit still pulled at his shoulders. He still thought the coffee on the executive floor tasted like it was brewed with contempt and condescension. Evelyn was still a ruthless, demanding CEO who terminated contracts and careers without blinking. They still argued constantly about speed bumps and schedules and whether Thomas needed to wear a tie to internal meetings. He did not wear the tie. She stopped asking, but something had shifted in the architecture of his life so fundamentally that the old blueprint was unrecognizable. Sarah had a new apartment with a bedroom of her own. The walls were covered in crayon drawings, dozens of them. Stick figures and green balloons and tall buildings, and a woman with black hair who appeared in nearly every picture now. Sarah breathed easily, deeply, the way a child should breathe, without the thin whistle of constricted airways that used to wake Thomas at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat. She had a specialist, the best in the city, fully covered. She had new shoes and a winter coat that actually fit and a backpack that wasn't held together with duct tape. She had stopped asking why Daddy looked gray. On a sunny Friday afternoon, Thomas drove his daughter home in a sensible sedan. Sarah sat in the back seat, chattering about dinosaurs, her voice clear and strong and uninterrupted by the rasp of failing lungs. No wheeze, no rattle, just the pure, uncomplicated joy of a 7-year-old who had enough air to talk about Tyrannosaurus Rex without stopping for breath. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text. Take her for ice cream, put it on the corporate card. E. Thomas let out a short laugh, a real one. The kind that surprised him because he had forgotten what it sounded like coming out of his own mouth. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and turned on the radio. Sarah hummed along to a song she didn't know the words to, inventing syllables that made no sense and all the sense in the world. The city didn't look so terrifying anymore. The streetlights didn't feel like interrogation lamps. The buildings didn't loom like monuments to a world that had no room for him. Thomas Miller had walked into the wrong room on the 50th floor of Apex Holdings on a cold Tuesday night, carrying a trash bag and $80 worth of fear. He had seen something he was never supposed to see, and the woman behind that door had done something that nobody in his life had ever done before. She had looked at his desperation and not seen weakness. She had seen exactly what she needed. Sometimes the ghost in the machine finally gets to step into the light, and sometimes walking into the wrong room is the only way to find the right person.